Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to lecture number 7 of our Understanding International Relations course. We will have a look today at the so-called English School of International Relations. We saw in our chapters 5 and 6 two approaches, eager to emphasize the limits of realism, that is to say, eager to analyze aspects of international relations that the realists had neglected because they considered them to be of secondary importance. In chapter 5, we had summed up the neo-Marxist approach, focusing on north-south relations rather than east-west relations, and more specifically analyzing what they consider to be the relations of dependence of the periphery of the world capitalist economy from the core of this world capitalist economy. And in our chapter 6, we saw the so-called transnationalist approach, claiming that the most important characteristic of international relations is interdependence among societies, due notably to the rise of non-state actors. Today, chapter 7, we'll have a look at another approach, challenging realism, but challenging realism from within, to some extent, that is to say, proposing an alternative analysis of the domain of interstate relations, narrowly defined as relations mainly concerned by war and peace, security and conflict and cooperation issues. And this approach then is the so-called English School of International Relations. And to better understand why it emerged and why it was, and still is, successful, we have to go back to the context summed up in the French expression due to the General de Gaulle, Détente, Entente, and cooperation, détente, entente, meaning understanding, agreement in French. So we saw in our chapter 3 that the Cold War can be divided into 3 periods of high tensions and into 3 periods of at least tentative dialogue. The 3 periods of high tensions lasted from the first one, 48 roughly, to 53, Stalin's death. The second from 58, the starting point of the second Berlin crisis, to 62, the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the third period of high tensions went from second half of the 70s up to the beginning of the 80s, the end of the Euro Missile Crisis. So somehow short periods separated by periods of at least tentative dialogue from 53 to 56, the so-called thaw period. From 62 to 75, 76, this is the period that was called Détente, Entente, and cooperation, and the last period of the Cold War after Gorbachev's arrival to power in 85 up to 89, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, or 91, the collapse of the USSR. We also saw in our chapter 3 that realists focused precisely, classical realists, focused on the periods of tensions when proposing their analysis of the Cold War as a bipolar system characterized first and foremost by the bipolar confrontation opposing the 2 superpowers in a kind of never-ending state of war. The risk of war, according to realists, always existed, opposing the Soviets to the Americans. Logically, then, the English school, since it proposes an alternative analysis of the same period within which it was embedded too, the English school will focus on the periods of dialogue rather than on the periods of tension. And notably on the second period, which goes from 62, the peaceful end of the Cuban Missile Crisis that we saw in our chapter 4, to roughly 75, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. This period indeed was characterized by a gradually warming up of the East-West relations, notably 4 processes characterized this period. First of all, and thanks to the peaceful end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 2 superpowers went through what has been called a nuclear learning process. That is to say, given the risks of a prospective suicide of mankind in the case of nuclear escalation, kind of in the case of a nuclear war opposing America to the USSR, the 2 superpowers first established a hotline between the Kremlin and the Pentagon or the White House in order to prevent, thanks to direct communication, in order to prevent any risk of accidental nuclear escalation. And a bit later, they started the so-called arms control process in the domain of nuclear weapons, signing major treaties, notably the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, whose aim was to limit the number of nuclear powers to the then 5 official nuclear powers, the US, the USSR, and the UK, France, and China, and to prevent any other state from acquiring nuclear weapons. And a bit later, they signed different other treaties, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, etc., etc. So they succeeded in limiting the increase, the number of the nuclear warheads that they were possessing at the very end of the Cold War during the last period. The second half of the 80s, they went further and adopted a disarmament process, the strategic arms reduction. It talks no more merely limitation, but reduction. Regarding our period here, the second important characteristic is that trade. There was a beginning of some commercial relations between the Soviets and the Americans. More specifically, the Americans accepted to export cereals to the USSR, which was unable to some extent to produce enough food for its own population. Trade relations, however, remain marginal due to the different economic system, free market economy in the West, in the US, a collective command economy in the USSR, and what's more, the Westerners, the Americans, refused, of course, to export any kind of technology that the Soviets might have used for their weapons. The export of technology was controlled by the so-called Coordination Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. The third characteristic, despite the somehow ideological rivalry, the 2 major powers ended up accepting one another's right to exist. That is to say, they implicitly agreed in maintaining the status quo, which profited to both of them, at least in their respective sphere of influence. So very concretely, and despite the ideological opposition between socialism or communism and liberal democracy, the USSR accepted under Khrushchev what Khrushchev had called peaceful coexistence, and the Americans never adopted a rollback strategy. They satisfied with the containment strategy that they adopted as early as 1947. Despite the very aggressive rhetoric of the 2 camps, Reagan, as late as in the 1980s, considered the USSR to be the evil empire. So despite their aggressive rhetoric, both superpowers behaved moderately when dealing directly with one another. And so they transformed their rivalry into a kind of implicit co-direction of the then international system, each one respecting the other one's sphere of influence, The US did not intervene in Hungary 56 or in Czechoslovakia 68 when the Soviets crushed the kind of anti-communist attempts. When Che Guevara was killed in Latin America, the USSR did not try to help him. So they avoided, the two major powers, any direct military confrontation. They controlled their respective satellites. They stopped short from trying to benefit from the other one's domestic difficulties. The USSR went through a difficult period after Stalin's death. They needed 3 years before agreeing upon the new leader, the new Secretary General of the Communist Party, Khrushchev. The US went through a somehow difficult period at the end of the Vietnam War, also during to the Watergate scandal of Nixon. This Détente period also permitted, for instance, France to leave the unified command of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It permitted Western Germany to establish a direct dialogue with Eastern Germany, the so-called Ostpolitik, to use the German term. China no longer remained loyal to the USSR. There was even a very short military dispute in 1969 in the Far East. And America, Kissinger more specifically, profited from this kind of rivalry within the socialist camp to establish diplomatic relations with China. So the two camps were no longer that rigid as they had been during the first 20 years of the Cold War. And last but not least, the fourth major process that took place during this period was the Helsinki Conference, 1975, the Conference on Cooperation and Security in Europe, where all both Western and Eastern European states met together with the US and Canada. In order to do what? Well, in order to adopt a set of rules, of principles that they committed themselves to respect, 10 principles more exactly. Therefore, it is called the Decalogue, the Declaration on Principles Guiding Relations between participating states. They agreed upon the non-use of force, upon the principle of sovereign equality, of frontiers should not be violated, on the peaceful settlement of disputes, and also on the freedom of thought, of religion, of belief, etc., conscience, which to some extent signifies the triumph of Western human rights, of the Western conception of human rights. This period then, ladies and gentlemen, was synonymous with the US and the USSR accepting to talk to each other, to meet regularly, which amounts to saying that the risk of war, to some extent, decreased between the two major powers. And it is precisely the existence of this dialogue, of this these summit meetings between the two major powers that the English school will emphasize, and that will incite members of this school to consider the Cold War no longer as a bipolar system, as had been the case of classical realists, but as a bipolar society. And I would like to quote Adam Watson, who proposed his concept of the bipolar society in a book that he published after the end of the Cold War, The Evolution of International Society, published in 1992, but the book was conceived during the Cold War. So here is the quote concerned, according to Adam Watson, the Cold War was a global but a restrained struggle. So you see that he emphasized restrained. The rift between the two powers was not as great as it is sometimes portrayed. Sometimes portrayed, of course, is an allusion to the then prevailing analysis of the Cold War as a state of war opposing the two superpowers. in a never-ending rivalry of different kinds. The two superpowers acquiesced in the establishment of two separate spheres of authority, which I summed this up some minutes ago. The relations between the two were chilly, but correct, no risk of direct war. Following the death of Stalin, 1953, the end of the first period of tensions, they explored the possibilities of containing their antagonism and conducting it in a less expansive and dangerous way, especially by means of a confidential dialogue, which became public later, and arms invitations agreements. We saw this notably in the domain of nuclear weapons. These attempts to moderate the arms race developed the idea of a wider understanding, the equivalent of the French Entente in the expression détente, entente, and a cooperation. So bipolar society, ladies and gentlemen, rather than a bipolar system. Society rather than system. And if we generalize, the term international society instead of international system. And we thus come to the core concepts of the English School of International Relations. The term English School was coined in the 1980s. It was a little bit ironic, if not even pejorative, but it was adopted by the members of this approach, which as early as in the 50s had created the so-called British Committee on the Theory of International Politics. English School, because the scholars concerned were teaching in English British universities. They were not all of English or British nationality, citizenship. There were Canadians, there were Australians. This, of course, was due to the Commonwealth, the exchanges between universities belonging to Commonwealth countries. The most important authors of the English School at the very beginning, when it was created, were Martin White, who rediscovered what he called the three traditions of international relations theory, that is to say, of international political philosophy, history of political thought, interested in international relations. De Boer was the second founding father. His most important book was The Anarchical Society, published in 1977. He proposed different definitions to which we will come back in a few minutes. And the third one of the first generation, Adam Watson, a historian, in his Evolution of International Society. The English School of International Relations, if we compare this approach, if we look at the specificities when comparing it to those paradigms that we already saw in our previous chapters, regarding the second debate opposing traditional scholars to behaviorist ones, qualitative research methods to quantitative inquiries, the English school belongs to the traditional approach. It uses history, it uses international law, it refers to philosophy or political theory, and therefore is regarding this dimension, it is very close to classical realists. It is also close to realists because it focuses on states as the most important actors on the international scene. It is a state-centric approach, at least up to the, I would say, the very contemporary members of nowadays English school. But the first generation, the founding fathers, and even the second generation, we'll come back to the second generation in the second part of today's class, are state-centric rather than transnationalist. Those are theories that we saw in our chapter 6. And regarding the substantive claims that this English school puts forward, it, as I already said, proposes an alternative analysis to the Cold War, that is to say, an analysis which, rather than being realist inspired, is basically a liberal in its philosophical postulates, liberal in the meaning of John Locke's philosophy, as opposed to the realist philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. And Martin White, in his course on the history of international political thought, had distinguished three traditions, the three R's, as he called them: the realist tradition, the rationalist tradition, and the revolutionary tradition. The realist tradition is associated to Thomas Hobbes and to Machiavelli. The rationalist is what I feel free to call the liberal tradition, going back to Locke and to Grotian. And the third one, the revolutionist, the revolutionary tradition, is associated to Immanuel Kant, but also to Karl Marx. That is to say that within each tradition, each of the three traditions, there are some differences between more moderates and more extreme versions. For instance, in realism, we have offensive realism and defensive realism. We'll come back to this also in our chapter 8, the contemporary neo-realists. At least the most important of them, Kenneth Walls, was a defensive realist as opposed to Morgenthau's offensive classical realism. So the English school, with its concept of international society, we'll come back to this too, is very close to the second tradition of Martin White, rationalism, I feel free to call it, liberalism in the philosophical meaning of the term. What is beyond any doubt is that the English school rejects Thomas Hobbes's approach, and to better understand the positive claims of the English school, we have to sum up Hobbes's conception as opposed to John Locke's conception of the state of nature among men first, and then the state of nature among nation states. Both were contractualist philosophers. That is to say, they claimed, or they invented, or they imagined a pre-societal or pre-political state of nature within which men lived. So according to Thomas Hobbes, this state of nature, which he sums up in chapter 13 of his Leviathan, published in 1651, according to Thomas Hobbes, in the state of nature among men, primitive men, if I may use this term, the natural condition of men was characterized by men being jealous, egoistic, evil, aggressive, bad. And he summed up this picture, very pessimistic picture of human nature, in the Latin expression homo homini lupus est. In English, every man is a wolf to any other man. Every man tries to not merely to survive, but to impose his will. That is to say, to exert his power upon possibly any other man in order to dominate, sometimes by eliminating other men. Now, according to Hobbes, nature has made men roughly equal in physical strength and also in the faculties of mind. So men are more or less equal, which means that there is a kind of equality of hope in obtaining what they are looking for. And therefore, when two men, I quote, desire the same thing, which they cannot both enjoy at the same time, when they desire the same thing, well, they become enemies. So in the state of nature among men, men are enemies. And in order to obtain what they're looking for, they endeavor, I quote, to destroy or to subdue one another. The state of nature, therefore, is a state of war. A state of war, and wars among men, and the same will be true among nation states, because Hobbes will transfer this analysis to his picture of international politics. wars may break out, or disputes, quarrels, violent quarrels among men may break out because of three major reasons: competition, diffidence, and glory. Competition incites men to go to war against other men in order to increase their gains, their material prosperity to some extent. Diffidence incites men to go to war for their own safety. They feel insecure. They are not confident in what the other one may do. They mistrust other men, and therefore they may go to war to make sure that they live in security. And the third reason, glory, men are driven by a will to promote their honor, their prestige, their reputation. And for this reason, life in the state of nature is, I quote again, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Short because of men killing one another. What do the men do in order to get out of this short life, which expects them the perspective of a short life, of a poor, solitary, nasty, brutish life? Well, they sign a social covenant, they sign a social contract to establish a political authority, which then will protect their security in exchange of their loyalty to the political authority, the sovereign representative at the head of the Leviathan, at the head of the state, the nation state that they will create. No such state, however, exists. No such Leviathan, exists, however, among or above the different states. That is to say, men create different political units, different political entities, and these political units are independent from one another, sovereign from one another, acknowledging no authority above them, which means that they are in a state of nature, and this state of nature, therefore, is a state of war. Look at Thomas Hobbes's quote: states and commonwealths not dependent on one another, independent from one another, to put it differently, live in the condition of a perpetual war, in a condition of a perpetual war. Upon the confines of battle, with their frontiers armed, their cannons planted against their neighbors around about. To put it differently, ladies and gentlemen, and this is important, and it is the roots of the classical realist approach, though Morgenthau almost never refers directly to Hobbes in his Politics Among Nations. This is the reason why I did not mention Hobbes in chapter 3. So according to Hobbes, states, because of their independence, look at the second part of the quote, kings and persons of sovereign authority, or states or nation states today, because of their independence, are in continual jealousies in the state and posture of gladiators, having their weapons pointing, their eyes fixed on one another, that is, their forts garrisoned and guns upon the frontiers of their kingdoms, continual spies upon their neighbors, which is a posture of war. States are in a state of war with one another. So please note the exact meaning of the concept of the state of war in Thomas Hobbes's political philosophy. The state of war does not mean that always effective, actual, manifest wars, armed disputes are occurring. It merely means the state of war that states never exclude the possibility of going to war, of using violent means of conflict resolution when they think, or when the statesmen think that it is in their interest to do so. The nature of war, look at the last part of the quotes, does not consist in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. As long as states are disposed to go to war in the case they consider war to be rational, to permit them to obtain satisfaction, as long as this disposition exists, there can be no peace. There is a state of war. There can be no peace. Peace, in the meaning of a period without an actual war, is mere, at best, a truce or a cease fire, a separating the war of the past from the war of the future. As long as there is no assurance that the disposition to go to war has disappeared, there is no peace, there is a state of war. In order for peace to prevail, there must be no more disposition to go to war. States must abandon war as a means of conflict resolution. And since this is unimaginable, not merely for Hobbes, but also for contemporary realists and almost classical realists, there can be, strictly speaking, no peace in the strong meaning, in the strong meaning of the term, according to realists. And it is, according to Hobbes and according to realists, and it is precisely this model, this picture of Thomas Hobbes, which underpinned the classical realists' analysis of the Cold War as a state of war, as a bipolar confrontation between the Soviets and the Americans. Though, I repeat what I already said, Morgenthau does not refer explicitly to Thomas Hobbes' Levite. This analysis then is rejected by the English school, which is closer to what Martin White called Grotianism or rationalism. I feel free to call it liberalism, because of John Locke's political philosophy put forward in his second treatise on civil government, published one generation later than Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan in 1690, that is to say, immediately after the glorious revolution which permitted England to become a constitutional monarchy. Locke's starting point is the same as Thomas Hobbes regarding the state of nature. We already saw this in our first introductory chapter. No authority above states. States are living in the state of nature with one another. Look at the first part of the quote. But he refuses to equate the state of nature with never-ending state of war, which, according to him, some men have confounded. Some men, he alludes to Hobbes. He criticizes Hobbes without mentioning his name. Why shouldn't we confound the state of nature among nation states, also among men? But I no longer go to the primitive state of nature among men. In Locke's description, I focus mainly on the state of nature among nation states. Why is there a difference between the state of nature among nation states and the state of war? Because the state of war, as depicted by Hobbes, is a state of enmity, malice, violence, and mutual destruction. Now, this is not the case among nation states. They are independent from one another. They live in the state of nature, but said state of nature is, look at the quote, a state of peace, of goodwill, of mutual assistance, and of preservation. And to put it differently, ladies and gentlemen, according to John Locke, the state of nature, the anarchical structure is not synonymous of the international system, is not synonymous with a violent nature. Anarchical structure, but not violent nature of international politics. Only when states go to war, there is a state of war. But this is the case only temporarily. That is to say, the state of peace prevails, and it is sometimes, though it is sometimes interrupted temporarily by actual resorts to violent disputes. In Hobbes' philosophy, it was exactly the opposite. There was a never-ending, all-encompassing state of war. Temporarily, there were periods of ceasefire, separating wars of effective, actual wars of the past from those of the future. So it's the perfect opposite, the perfectly opposite picture of international politics. According to John Locke, the absence of an authority above states does not exclude the possibility of states living in peace. Living in peace thanks to what? Thanks to the common rules that they accept to establish in order precisely to regulate peacefully their interactions, in order to find solution solutions to their divergent interests by compromise, by negotiations, by a dialogue, rather than by violence. So common rules, therefore, exist among states. They are established by the states themselves. There is no authority telling them to do so or imposing such rules, of course. And the fact for them to be able to establish by signing concrete treaties, this is what it concretely means, the fact for states to establish such rules proves, according to the English school, classical realists will not agree, of course, that beyond the international system, there is an international society. This then is the core concept of the English school of international relations. What then is concretely an international society as opposed to an international system? We already saw the definition of an international system in our introduction. Hadley-Burke's definition is the following one. There is an international system when states have regular interactions among one another. And when these interactions are sufficiently regular to make the behavior of each a necessary element in the calculations of the other. This is to say, every state, before acting on the international scene, takes into account the potential reaction of potentially any other state. As soon as we have such regular interactions and such anticipatory calculations, there is a system. An international society, however, is more than a mere system. It is, to some extent, a regulated international system thanks to common rules. So let's look at the definitions proposed first by Hadley-Burke. An international society, which can also be called the society of states, or an anarchical society, and this precisely was the title of Hadley-Burke's book. An international society exists when a group of states, not necessarily all the states, we come back to this, but the group, a set of states, due to them being conscious of sharing either a common interests or common values, we'll come back to this too, conceive themselves to be bound by a set of common rules in their relations with one another, and share in the working of common institutions, very concretely, common organizations, international organizations. I repeat what I already said, international organizations are not non-governmental organizations. International institutions or organizations are interstate organizations. The English school is a state-centric approach. The second definition of international society is complementary, of course, to the first one. It was proposed by Hadley-Burke and Adam Watson. States have established by dialogue and consent common rules and institutions for the conduct of their relations. In doing so, they form an international society, all the more so since most of the times they maintain these arrangements. That is to say, they respect the rules that they establish very concretely when assigning treaties. What do these norms then consist in? Well, according to Hadley-Burke, there are three sets of rules relative to the mutual recognition of states' sovereignty. That is to say, states do recognize each other as a sovereign, separate, independent units. This is different from what had occurred in the past. Empires, we saw this too in our introductory chapter. Empires tried to get rid of one another since they were unable to do so once they were roughly equal in military strength. What did they do? Well, they had almost no contact with one another. They ignored each other. So they did not recognize each other, but they had no interaction. The second set of rules regards the limitation of armed violence among states. States sign treaties referring at least implicitly to what may be called the just war doctrine. Wars of defense are legitimate. Wars of aggression or offensive wars of conquest are considered to be illegitimate. They are therefore stigmatized. This is the case in the UN Charter, Chapter 7. Only defensive wars on behalf of the individual and collective right of legitimate defense are are allowed nowadays. The third set of rules relative to favoring cooperation among states, of course, all the cooperation that exists in all the domains, in economy, in finance, in the environment, in trade, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the Kyoto or Paris Protocol and the Paris Agreement regarding climate change, etc., etc. These rules favor cooperation among states. And there are three sets of institutions, also according to Hadley-Bull, which contribute to form the international society: diplomatic conventions, that is to say, the fact for states to exchange ambassadors. The balance of power, according to the English school, states agree implicitly in not becoming too powerful than other states, thus maintaining a balance, which, according to the English school, is likely to permit stability to prevail. We will come back to this both in chapter 8 on neorealism, because the same idea is shared by Kenneth Walls. And we'll come back to it also in our chapter 11. The power psychotheorists do not consider the balance of power to be stability prone. They prefer a unipolar structure. Anyway, the great power management refers directly to what the English school scholars were witnessing during the period of Détente, Entente, and cooperation. The fact that the two American and Soviet superpowers agreed in managing together the then international system by adopting a kind of self-restraint behavior in their direct relations. So according to Hadley-Bull, according to the English school, and first and foremost, the first generation of English school scholars, the aim of these norms, of these rules, of these institutions is to permit stability to prevail. Stability on the international scale, worldwide systemic stability on the one hand, and the security and independence of the different units, that is to say, the different nation states, taken individually. And this exactly reflected the period of the 60s and the 70s as regards the confrontation between the Soviets and the Americans. No direct war broke out between the two superpowers, thanks to the great power management that they were able to practice. The Cold War, therefore, was not a state of war according to the English school. They reject the classical realist analysis of the Cold War. Let's come back to the definition, the general definition of international society, ladies and gentlemen. The existence of common rules established by states, at least the group of states who share, who are conscious of sharing a common interest and common values. If we look at the Cold War, the common rules that they established, notably in the domain of arms control, these common rules were based on common interests, and not on common values, of course. And the Soviets and the Americans did not share common values by definition, since the Soviets referred to socialist or communist principles and values, the Americans and the Westerners more generally to liberal, to democratic values and principles. So the Cold War was an international or bipolar society, to use the term of Adam Watson. It was bipolar society because of the common interests held by the Soviets and the Americans. But sometimes it is conceivable that states agree upon some rules thanks to common values. This means, ladies and gentlemen, that we should, and this is what the English school does, we should distinguish two types of international societies, two kinds of international societies, depending on whether the common rules are established first and foremost thanks to common interests of the states concerned, among the states concerned, or first and foremost thanks to common values. So two types of international societies. When states, and this goes beyond the Cold War, when those states that agree in establishing common rules, when these states establish these rules because they share common interests, as was the case during the Cold War, the international society concerned is called a pluralist international society by English school scholars, a pluralist international society. Implicitly, this refers to what the German, one of the German founding fathers of sociology, Ferdinand Tönnies, had called a society in German, Gesellschaft. What is a society, ladies and gentlemen? A society is an artificial grouping. The members of a society consider this society to be instrumental, that is to say, they are smart enough to understand that with the other members of the society concerned, they share common interests, but the links that they have are impersonal. They share the same interests, that is to say, they are smart enough to understand that they have to cooperate in order to achieve their own objectives. A firm is a society. There are no common values among employers and employees, but they share the same interests to make profits in order to earn some money, either as employer or as employee. Opposed to this pluralist international society, or society in general, and international society in our case, is the solidarist international society, which exists when the states that establish some common rules share more than mere interests. That is to say, when they share common values. And this solidarist type of an international society refers somehow to what Ferdinand Tönnies in his sociology had called a community. That is to say, Gemeinschaft in German. A community is a natural grouping as opposed to an artificial one. A family, a neighborhood, a tribe is most of the time a natural grouping. That is to say, those who are part of it are linked by a feeling of togetherness. They spontaneously share the same values, the same beliefs. They act in accordance with the norms spontaneously prevailing within the community, and they do not even conceive of adopting another behavior, since they have internalized these principles, these rules as normal, as natural. A family is probably the best example of a community. So if we go back to international relations, the Cold War was a pluralist international society because of the common interests that had inside it. After, notably, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets and the Americans to agree upon some rules that they explicitly mentioned in different treaties, notably the arms control treaties. So the Cold War was a bipolar society, a bipolar pluralist society. It was a society because of these rules. It was bipolar because it was divided into two camps or two blocks. This division, however, or the rivalry was limited thanks to the common interests that both had in not going too far in their confrontation, in nevertheless maintaining some dialogue. This Cold War, ladies and gentlemen, came to an end 15 years or so after 1975, that is to say, after the end of this period of détente, entente, and cooperation. And only one major power survived, the US. The USSR collapsed and no longer exists, has been existing since 1991. This new context and the post-Cold War context gave birth to a new generation of English school scholars. Notably belong to this generation Gareth Gong, who published his book in the 1980s, The Standard of Civilization, International Society. I nevertheless consider him to be part of the second generation because of his somehow critical approach. The second generation, ladies and gentlemen, of the English school is more critical than the first one. It underscores what we may call the dark side of international societies, both in the past and of nowadays, that is to say, of the post-Cold War world. The second, chronologically speaking, important actor is a jurist, Jerry Simpson, who published this book, Great Powers and Outer States, in 2004. And the third one is, again, strictly speaking, international relations scholar Ian Clarke, with his book published in 2005, Legitimacy in International Society. What is very interesting in this second generation of English school scholars is that they go back to the origin of the international society. They not merely focus on the bipolar society of the Cold War, they go back to the origins. And given their somehow critical outlook, well, they emphasize the fact that past international societies on the one hand and the contemporary one, the post-Cold War world, are somehow hierarchical international society. Because of what? Because of the prevalence of specific values, and first and foremost of Western values. So they propose a kind of a division of the evolution over time of international relations and distinguish three periods. The first period goes from the birth of the international society in the midst of the 17th century, the Westphalian treaties that we saw in our first chapter, in our introduction, up to World War II. So during 300 years, the international society was a pluralist one in Europe. Europe was dominating the world at that time, but it was a solidarist international society beyond Europe. That is to say, when Europeans dealt with non-European entities that they met overseas. I'll come back to this. Christian values, the values of enlightenment, the values of civilization were prevailing when the Europeans met overseas populations. Second period, the period of the Cold War, the one of the founding fathers of the English school, was a pluralist international society based on common interests of all the states and first and foremost of the Americans and the so on. And third period, nowadays world, the one that is prevailing for some 30 years now, since the end of the Cold War, once again is a solidarist type of international society because of the preeminence, the dominance of Western values, democracy, human rights, and a free market economy. So let's have a look at these three periods, a kind of historical survey of the non-material dimension of international order, of the international society's evolution as opposed to the international systems, or as distinguished from the international systems evolution over time. First period, from the beginning of the midst of the 17th century, we could go back to the 16th century, but I prefer to start with the Westphalian treaties up to World War II. This international society was a pluralist one regarding the European countries. Why? Well, because of what we saw in our introduction. What did we see? We saw that the Westphalian treaties were signed by the belligerents of the 30 Years' War, which had opposed the Catholic to the Protestant units of the then Holy Roman Empire of German nation. The 30 Years' War was won by the French, and Sweden, the Dutch, lost by the Austrians, the Catholic entities of the Germanic Empire and Spain. And the French imposed, therefore, the sovereignty principle, the equal sovereignty principle. But that is to say, from 1648 onwards, all the European states, whatever their religion, Catholic or Protestant, were considered as legitimate. That is to say, they were independent from one another, they were sovereign, and there was no interference in the domestic affairs of the different units, which meant that pluralism was prevailing. There was no obligation to adopt one single religion. Both the Protestant and the Catholic religion were considered, or domestic regimes were considered to be legitimate. A pluralist international society in Europe. However, when dealing with the non-European world, the non-European powers rediscovered the common roots of their distinct versions of Christianity. That is to say, be they Catholic or Protestant, they claimed that they were Christians when dealing with non-Christians. First and foremost, those pagan or heathen entities that they met overseas in North and South America, in Africa, in Asia. Beyond then Europe, the common Christian values were predominating, which meant that these territories could be conquered. Their independence was not acknowledged because they did not, these populations overseas did not share the same Christian values. So pluralist in Europe, but solidarist overseas, where the non-Christian units were converted at best to Christianity, and at worst they were eliminated, annihilated physically during the colonial conquests of, before 1648, the Spaniards and the Portuguese, and then more and more the British, the French, the Dutch, and a bit later the Germans, the Italians, the Belgians, etc., etc. During this period then, throughout 3 centuries, more than 3 centuries, the international society was limited to Europe. It was a pluralist one because overseas, the Europeans did not acknowledge non-European units to be their equals. Europeans considered themselves to be superior. The other ones were considered to be inferior. They could be conquered and converted to Christianity, to private property, to civilization. The standard of civilization was imposed upon non-European units, to quote Jared Gong's analysis, the standard of civilization in international society. And this conception was perfectly summed up by Voltaire in his analysis of Louis XIV, the French Sun King's century. Look at Voltaire. For some time now, it has been possible to consider Christian Europe, be it Protestant or Catholic, as a sort of great commonwealth. The French expression, une sorte, une espèce de grande république, that is to say, kind of united Europe, though being partitioned into several states, some monarchic, others mixed, some aristocratic, others popular, etc. But they all deal with one another. They talk to one another. They are not in a state of war as claimed by Hobbes or classical realists. They all have the same basic religion, Christianity, though divided into Catholicism and Protestantism. And above all, look at the last part of the quote, they have the same principles of public law. Public law was a term of the law of nations, which became international law. Remember our first chapter. All having the same principles of public law, unknown in other parts of the world. Unknown in other parts of the world. Europeans at that time distinguished themselves from the rest of the world. Us versus them. We are superior, and we have the right to conquer them in order to convert them to our values. And look at the quotes, there is an allusion to Russia. Christian Europe forms a kind of great commonwealth, give or take Russia, give or take Russia. Voltaire, in the 1750s, in the midst of the 18th century, so more than 2.5 centuries ago, we don't know exactly what to do with Russia. Was it part of Christian Europe or not? Ladies and gentlemen, you understand my allusion to contemporary Russia, Putin's Russia. Is it considered or not to be part of Europe? Not of the European Union, of Europe. The question is not easy to respond. You choose the response that you prefer. But somehow, we nowadays still have the same perception of Russia as being somehow, but not completely European. And basically, the same is true for Turkey. Why? Well, for the very same reasons. Both Russia and Turkey do not share the same values with the rest of Europe, Central or Western Europe. The Russians because of their Orthodox religion, the Turks because of their Muslim religion, the Russians because of their illiberal democratic regime, and the same is all the more so true for Turkey. So you see that an analysis of international relations in terms of international society is perfectly relevant nowadays to understand some aspects of contemporary international political relations, notably between Europe, the European continent, with Russia on the one hand, Turkey on the other hand. So the first period, the international society was pluralist in Europe, solidarist beyond. It became worldwide pluralist thanks to the United Nations. After 1945, the international society was institutionalized in the international organization called the United Nations Organization. The world was no more European-centered. All units that managed to become a state, either in 1945 or gradually during the decolonization process that we alluded to in our chapter 5, were automatically admitted as full legitimate members of the United Nations, whatever their domestic regime, whatever their degree of civilization. Why? Because probably of the defeat of the former colonial powers. When I say defeat, I should say because these former colonial powers were weakened during World War II, and they belong to the winners, strictly speaking, but they were no more superpowers after World War II. Only two major states remained powers, and specifically superpowers, the US and the Soviets. Now, both rejected the colonial practices of the past, the Soviets because of their proclaimed socialist principles or values, the Americans because of their own past. They had become independent after getting rid of the British colonial presence. So after World War II, throughout the Cold War, pluralism prevailed. Whatever a state's domestic regime, democratic or not, socialist, communists, military dictatorship, etc., they were as such accepted as full members of the United Nations. There was no right of any other state to interfere in these states' domestic affairs. This prevailed up to the end of the Cold War. Why? Because since the end of the Cold War, last point in today's class, the new international society is again a pluralist one, and this, ladies and gentlemen, explains why we call it international community. Remember what I said, community in the meaning of Tönnies sociology, states members of a community share the same values. So we then now claim there is an international community. We, the Westerners, in our media, in the politicians' discourses, the term international community is used almost every day, and probably you do use it in your own discussions. Why do we use the term international community? Because we think that our values, liberal democracy, human rights, free market economy, are universal, should be adopted by everybody. Though the world is divided, since Fukuyama's end of history thesis, in this perception, in a post-historical world of precisely these liberal democratic entities and the still historical world of former third world states, of former colonial territories, of underdeveloped economies where liberalism has not triumphed yet, and where still risks of war are existing. So since we consider our values to be superior, what do? Well, Western democracies, Western liberal democracies, both their governments and also their non-governmental organization, this is a link with the chapter of last week, claim that they somehow have the right and the duty precisely to impose their values, to spread them and to impose them, sometimes even forcefully, in the still historical world, to permit these entities to reach our level of civilization, of democracy, if possible, of prosperity. And very concretely, we nowadays distinguish beyond the post-historical world of our liberal democracies, we distinguish failed states and rogue states or rogue regimes. Failed states, sometimes called collapsed states, shadow states, weak states, fragile states, are those states which are not states, strictly speaking, in the strict definition of states. And this is to say, there is no state apparatus likely to maintain order, domestic order, all the less so likely to permit a kind of welfare to the majority of the population. In these failed states, then, we have the right to interfere in order to practice what we call state building, regime building, nation building, democracy building. And this explains the presence of many Western experts and sometimes of blue berets or blue helmets of the United Nations throughout the last decade in Cambodia, in Haiti, in Liberia, etc., etc. And what's more, not merely do we interfere peacefully, we also sometimes intervene militarily. Where? Well, in and against rogue states or rogue regimes. That is to say, those states or those regimes that are accused of either violating massively human rights that we consider to be universal, massively violating human rights against their own populations, or rogue regimes because they threaten their neighbors, because they sponsor terrorist networks, because they are eager to acquire weapons of mass destruction. And this concept or notion, actually, because it is a political and ideological notion and not a scientific concept of rogue states, were attacked during military interventions, sometimes called humanitarian interventions. Actually, it's the interventions are military operations, that is to say, wars. This was the case in Somalia in 1992. It was the case in Yugoslavia twice against Milosevic's regime, 1995 in Bosnia, 1999 in Kosovo. And the US intervened after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, 2001, George Bush once again intervened against Iraq, Saddam Hussein in 2003. Sarkozy and Cameron were at the origin of a military operation against Gaddafi in Libya 2011, at the beginning of the Arab Spring. And last but not least, the intervention in Syria, both against ISIS, but also to some extent against Assad, who, however, was saved or helped by the Russians, and indirectly also by the Turks. So nowadays, international society is called international community because it is a solidarist type. If we use typology of the English school, we Westerners consider our values to be preeminent, and we do not hesitate to try to spread and sometimes even to impose them forcefully. What will be the future, ladies and gentlemen, of this international society of the new solidarist type? Well, maybe we have reached the end of this so-called international community. Maybe this solidarist type of international society belongs to the past. Why? Because of America's decision some months ago, August 2021, Joe Biden's decision to withdraw America's troops from Afghanistan. He announced that America would withdraw its troops. He also announced that America would no longer be practicing state-building operations, as it has done together with the French, the British, other NATO members, of course, for the last 2 decades and a half now. No more state-building operations, no more spread of Western values. Why? Because America has to focus on what? In his speech held on August 31, when he justified his decision to withdraw American troops, America has to focus now on the rise of China, and it has to cope with Russia's new assertiveness. That is to say, Joe Biden adopts a realist analysis of the contemporary world. That is to say, realism, once again, may be successful. We will see now chapter 11, but in our next chapter, next week, chapter 8, we will see that after the period of détente that we analyze nowadays through the English school, realism already re-emerged the first time during the Cold War in its neo-realist version, to be distinguished from the classical version. We will see this next week in our chapter 8. I wish you a great day. Once again, thank you very much for attending this class, and see you again, I hope so, next week. Goodbye.